You ready? All right, now this one's a little bit different. This one's a little bit different because I'm actually going to have a lot of pragmatic advice in this. This will be a little less flash and a little less complication, which I'm sure some of you will be thankful of. Okay, so first of all, I started keto in April of 2015, and I lost 25 pounds, yay, all right. And then I became obsessed with cholesterol research after I saw my own total and LDL cholesterol skyrocket. I started doing a whole lot of extensive N-of-1 experiments. Now, some of you have already witnessed this several times before this point. I literally take a picture of every single thing I ingest. In fact, I have a standing order with every single conference I go to. If you can ever catch me ingesting something and take a picture of first, I'll give you $100, $100 US dollars. I also take a lot of blood tests. How many blood tests? About 105 blood tests since November of 2015, and I will actually be hitting 3 years next month. This was the blog that I started reporting all of these N-of-1 experiments at. Over time, it has actually turned into a place for which a lot of low carbers and low carb doctors and medical professionals will go to. It's kind of become almost a sort of digital lipid university in a sense, because there's so much information that comes in now. And what we try to do is we try to actually have lots of helpful and useful information. That's part of why I'm showing this to you now. There are no advertisements. If I have my druthers, it will never be funded by any kind of membership or any affiliates or anything. It is entirely funded by individuals, as I mentioned before. I mean for this to always be free and available, especially for people who are in the dark hour I was in November 2015, where I didn't know where to go when I saw that my LDL cholesterol had skyrocketed. Fortunately, we now have lots of information for people to look at. And in fact, one of the most hit pages is our simple guide to cholesterol and low carb. Now, this is very friendly, has lots of illustrations. We'll take you through the basics of lipidology. And ironically, although I wrote this for lay people, medical professionals have pinged me a lot more on this than anyone else. It's actually gotten quite popular. And I can't emphasize enough, this next thing is actually kind of a scary slide to me. The comments that we get aren't like typical comments you would see in social media. A lot of people voluntarily bring their lipids forward and put them in the comments. We even have tools to help them out to do that. So what have the comments been looking like over the course of the life cycle of the site? It's been getting a bit intense. In fact, for two of us that are working on it full time, we're actually going to have to take on more people. But throughout all of this time that people are submitting their lipid profiles and we're actually talking about it, we always say the same things over and over again. No, we're not medical professionals, and this does not constitute medical advice. That said, here's the research and the data that we have up to this point. And in many ways, this is helping to emerge a kind of new sort of I like to coin it as open source science. It's going to be part of the book that I'll be putting out about this whole story in the first place. We've also opened up a Facebook group for lean mass hyperresponders. Some of you are already familiar with this term, and I'll kind of talk about it a little bit more later. This was actually open just a few months ago, and I actually took the screenshot this morning. I can't even believe it. We're actually up to almost 800 members. 42 just this week. Obviously, there's not only a lot of people joining, but a lot of people are very interested in talking about the science behind this. So, I was challenged by some folks to try to have a mini lesson on the inversion pattern. Usually I spend a lot of time on the inversion pattern to try to tweak it, and of course it gets a bit technical. This is my attempt to keep it rather basic, just 5 slides, I promise. For those of you who don't know, I make cool graphs like this with my blood, eating certain food in a certain way. And what you're looking at right now is actually in the dotted orange line, a 3-day average of my dietary fat. And in the blue line, the day after, or rather the morning after's LDL cholesterol. And since then, if for those people who are actually somewhat familiar with my work, you know why this has become somewhat ubiquitous. This is actually a protocol now that a lot of people have actually done, and I think last count I saw, we've sort of lost track. Somewhere in the neighborhood of around 180 different people have actually done this. What's the science behind that? Well, again, this is the boiled down simplified version, but it's fairly straightforward. There are really 2 lipoproteins, lipid carrying proteins. Chylomicrons, you heard Ken talking about this a little bit earlier, and that mainly is a boat that carries fat from food you just ate. What ride shares in that boat? Cholesterol. Okay, what about VLDLs? Well, this is mostly via fat from your adipose, your body fat, right? And this also expires in a few hours, but a large portion of these turn into LDL. You guys hear the letters LDL a lot? I certainly do. So LDL particles also carry cholesterol. But remember, if the precursor is VLDLs and they're delivering fat-based energy through your body, well, then it actually kind of makes sense that if you're eating a lot of fat, then that might actually go down. And that's what I'm about to illustrate now. So generally the gist of it is that your body is looking backwards in sort of a 3-day window. And in doing so, when it sees that, oh, there's actually a lot of fat coming in, I'm eating lots and lots of fat, well, then, you know the endocrine story, insulin, glucagon, etc. Bottom line is the body goes, don't need to actually bring out that many VLDLs. And if I don't need to bring out that many VLDLs, there's less succeeding LDLs. Conversely, let's say I'm not eating a lot of fat, well then guess what? Now the liver, particularly if I'm fat adapted, has reason to bring up VLDLs. And therefore you have more succeeding LDLs that carry the LDL cholesterol. That's it in a nutshell. How'd I do? Did I do okay? All right. So now let me give you some general advice to medical practitioners, especially that are here. First of all, you want to work with your patients to be sure that they take a proper cholesterol test. This is so important. I can't emphasize it enough. Ensure your patient eats as they normally would for the 5 days leading up to the test. If there's anything that you're going to find out from my research, it's just how volatile and how alterable, I guess you could say, the lipid numbers are. Do not lower fat or it will potentially spike total and LDL cholesterol markers. This is part of what the inversion pattern is. Likewise, don't do a multi-day fast unless that's what you're shooting for. If you're wanting to spike your LDL cholesterol numbers to, impress your GP, then that's what you can do. I've actually had some people who've said that they had fun doing that and then switching it around. You also want to be sure that you are 12 to 14 hours water-only fasted. Water-only fasted for the blood draw. And this is extremely relevant because guess what? If you are on a low-carb, high-fat diet, you have a nice fatty meal of eggs and bacon, and then 2 hours later, you get a cholesterol test. What did you just do? You just spiked your triglycerides coming in from chylomicrons. And that ends up having a potential lots of different changes that can then happen to your lipid panel. So be sure, 12 to 14 hours water fasted. And I'm going to get to why you also don't want to have other drinks, but please don't have coffee or tea as well. And this I've actually gotten from other doctors. This isn't actually from me, but a lot of other doctors who've been chatting with me when trying to troubleshoot how they can talk about cholesterol in a way that they can say, I'm a little more relaxed about this. They always provide guideline advice comparison. So yes, my official position as per the guidelines, or they'll say something along the lines of, well, the guidelines would tell me to tell you. And then effectively you've presented that, right? You've brought to the patient what the guidelines are saying. Then you can allow for observational data, and this, of course, shouldn't be something in which you're actually ordering it. You're saying, I've seen a lot of my patients go on a low-carb, high-fat diet. This seems to be working for them so far. And then, of course, as always, it's ultimately their choice in the end. I definitely recommend David Unwin. He really does it well. He presents the patients with a choice. Would you like to take some dietary intervention or lifestyle intervention, or would you like to just be on medication indefinitely? And he says it's a 100% success rate every single time. They'll go with the lifestyle intervention. So now we're going to get around to the part that a lot of you guys are genuinely worried about, that there's something that we like to call hyper responders. This has preceded my entry into this. There just happens to be, and there's a lot of debate as to just how much this is, anywhere from 5 to 30% of those people going on a low-carb diet who see their cholesterol numbers go up. We tend to call this at the site standard hyper responders. And then of that, there's a subset that we would call lean mass hyper responders. And lean mass hyper responders, I'm going to kind of get into a little bit more detail of. Your standard hyper responder is fairly straightforward. It's basically anybody who's got 150 milligrams per deciliter or higher, 3.88 millimoles or higher, particularly if that happened after they went on the diet. For lean mass hyperresponders, it's actually a very specific phenotype. The cut points are on 3 different metrics. LDL-C, much higher. LDL-C much higher, being 5.17, HDL-C of 2.07 or higher. And get this, triglycerides being especially low, 0.79 or lower. And while this is somewhat rare, within the low-carb community, there's actually quite a few lean mass hyperresponders. That was the group I just showed you before. And we've already been running a poll recently. I want to say probably somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 250 have actually made their way into that Facebook group. Again, this is just in the last few months. So here's a good example of lean mass hyperresponder. And here are the traits you typically see. Now, these are generalities, not certainties, but generally, they tend to be very lean, generally lower body fat percent. Also, they're usually moderate to very fit. Some are very athletic. In fact, there are a lot of ultramarathoner lean mass hyperresponders that you'll find, and they really fit this phenotype fairly well. And of course, they tend to be very low carb, typically 25 grams of net carbs or less. Now, here's some characteristics that you may not have known about, and particularly in watching the patterns become somewhat relevant. They often tend to have lower beta-hydroxybutyrate numbers than their sedentary counterparts. I'm going to go on a tiny little rant. One of my frustrations is a lot of people use BHB as a score for how deep into ketosis they are. As I've chatted with many of the keto dudes and everybody else, I actually get a bit frustrated about that because a blood test is ultimately something that you're capturing that's in transit and not yet in use. So if you have higher uptake, then all you're doing is you're capturing what was still left on the freeway before it made its exit, right? We don't think, oh, wow, I'm really like utilizing a lot of glucose because I have a lot of glucose in my blood. No, athletes, of course, will tend to have a lot less glucose if they're carb adapted. Same thing if you're fat adapted, especially if it comes with ketones. Now, here's where it gets a little more interesting and a bit more controversial. They tend to have higher levels of fasting glucose. I want to emphasize that, fasting glucose. And a lot of them will freak out about this because a lot of them will actually get healthier and healthier, become more of the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, and then they'll see their fasting glucose going up. I feel very strongly that this is adaptive glucose sparing. The huge clue is that their insulin is on the floor, right? So even though their glucose is much higher to something you would typically associate it with type 2 diabetes, it does not match the insulin that we see likewise. And more specifically, you don't see that high level of postprandial glucose spike that you would expect otherwise. So now let's talk about the report tool. This is also something else we intend to have as kind of a permalink, and we find that a lot of medical professionals have been using this. And of course, anybody can come here at any time. They can basically fill it out in real time. It's very straightforward. There's really just 6 fields. We may add a few more just to make it a little more useful for people. Basically, you can put in not only your different units, but as you can see, you can change what type of unit you use. It can either be in milligrams per deciliter or millimoles per liter. And what's neat is it feeds out this little report that's kind of meant to copy and paste. So you can basically just copy this text, put it into a form, send it to your doctor, send it to your patient, anything along those lines. But what I really like is that we put a little more focus into other risk markers that they don't. For example, remnant cholesterol, which is extremely relevant, and something known as atherogenic index of plasma. And I want to do a presentation someday where we actually just focus on that in particular. But these two have much more relevance when compared to LDL cholesterol, which we'll also talk about a little bit more in a second. So we tend to keep this, we're planning to keep this basically as a permanent link, as a /report, so feel free to go there. Again, we mean for all of these to be free indefinitely. All right, now let's talk about the big 4. So what I mean by the big 4 is, if you take the axis of HDL, and I do mean HDL cholesterol, and you plot it against the axis of triglycerides, there's clearly a risk association that emerges. And I'm going to kind of have them in these different 4 quadrants. You've got high HDL cholesterol, low triglycerides. Over here, high HDL cholesterol, but high triglycerides. Low HDL cholesterol, low triglycerides, and low HDL cholesterol, high triglycerides, often considered 2 of the parts of atherogenic dyslipidemia, which is a good reason why it's in red. So let's go to high HDL cholesterol, low triglycerides. What are the cut points we put? Well, before I tell you, let me emphasize this is all subject to change. As is typical with something for which I think all science should be based, you should be upfront about guidelines not actually being set in stone. That's one thing that I love about cholesterolcode.com is we'll change our guidelines just as fast as the data comes in to confirm otherwise. So what we like to see is an HDL cholesterol of 1.29 millimoles or higher, triglycerides of 1.13 or lower. That's it, right? We're all good? Everyone agreed? Yeah? Well, actually, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to say, now there's a metric that's missing from here. It's LDL, LDL cholesterol, the big killer. I can understand that. I mean, that's the elephant in the room, if you will, particularly when we're talking about the low-carb diet, because of those hyperresponders who are going to see their LDL cholesterol go up, what does that mean? Well, for me, I'm an engineer, so I'm starting to look at the tools, and I'm looking at the metrics, and I'm seeing how it is that these different things ferret out. And sure enough, LDL cholesterol is very loosely associated with cardiovascular disease. Absolutely true. But when compared to triglycerides and HDL, it's not even a close call. Actually, this is much more relevant to heart disease, and this is actually much less relevant to heart disease. I kind of got frustrated in my process because in developing my lipid energy model, I kept coming around to, now wait a sec, this seems to be all about utilizing triglycerides effectively. That the high HDL is high because that actually is a reflection of those boats. You remember how I said they ride share? If the cholesterol is on the same boats as the triglycerides that got delivered, well, then all we need to do is see what the success was of the delivery of those triglycerides, right? If you're a harbor outside of this, let's say we look out on the ocean over there, and we see a harbor full of boats and they're going inbound and outbound, but we see that when they leave, they come back without the cargo that they left with. You come to the assumption that they succeeded, right? Okay, well then conversely, if we see the harbor full of boats that seem to be just bumping up against each other, they have nowhere where they can deliver their cargo, what does that look like? It looks like type 2 diabetes. You see high triglycerides, you see high VLDLs that don't remodel to LDLs, and you see high remnant cholesterol. All of these things are in common. So sure enough, when I've been able to find any and all studies that either look at the triglyceride to HDL ratio or actually look at hard endpoints, they all seem to look generally the same. This gets back to me being an engineer wanting to find the best measurement. If I want to find the best measurement, this is what I do. I call this the low carb cholesterol challenge. Because a lot of people out there who are lipid lowering experts will say, hey, you guys need to quit being blasé about your high LDL cholesterol. To which I say, look, from this energy model, I've come to this conclusion that actually, along with existing evidence that I see, high HDL and low triglycerides appears to be a very low risk factor for cardiovascular disease, whatever your LDL cholesterol is. If we're overly comforted, send me the best study that you have that shows high cardiovascular disease with high LDL, so long as it has high HDL and low triglycerides. And then, a little over 2 months ago, at the 6-month anniversary of this and my tweeting it out and reaching out and trying to talk to everybody about it, I said, let's put some money behind this. So I actually got a $1,000 US, $1,000 budget for which I said, look, I'm going to dole out $300. And I actually relaxed it a little bit more since there was discussion on what actually constitutes high or not. I said, look, just above average. And we'll go by heart.org, and we'll go by these standards. Just find me any study that shows high LDL with high HDL with low triglycerides is showing just above average cardiovascular disease or coronary heart disease. And I got a lot more grumbling about Mendelian randomization trials and so forth. I'm saying, look, just help me get this triad together. Help me to prove me wrong. And I genuinely mean that. As much as I may actually sound as if I'm an advocate for this, it does not mean that there actually aren't, say, 20 studies that disprove me. And I want to reward the person who can bring that forward so that I can move on with the rest of my life and have other things I can do. Get back to writing code, right? Okay, but how many pennies, dollars, hundreds do you think that I put out up to this point? Zero. It's not there. Again, I've had some people respond with some grumbling, but I thought at putting, say, $300 behind a search term, somebody would go ahead and put the work forward. For what it's worth, I've actually heard from some undergrad students about some people who've actually tried to find it and weren't able to find it. Well, so let me go ahead and put in front of you the evidence that we do have. Right now, this is one of my favorite studies. This actually was from our friends at Framingham Offspring. And we actually end up with 3,600 people after excluding users of lipid-lowering therapy and who were free of cardiovascular disease at baseline. Perfect setup, a nice broad base, right? And then we end up with this chart where this was sort of where they baselined it out. But if you look over at high HDL-C with low triglycerides, low LDL, we see kind of what we expect. The best of the cardiovascular disease outcomes. Not all-cause mortality outcomes, but if you're looking at cardiovascular disease in particular, great. All right, so what would we expect if we flip it and then look at everybody above that LDL level? So now we're talking everybody above. Well, we'd expect the odds ratio, which lower is better, would probably be like 1.4, 1.5, something like that. No, it's actually the second lowest risk group. And this is with it going above. So at that point, I was like, okay, well, maybe the LDL is, it's not looking at just it might have like, say, 2.6 or 2.63 or something along those lines. Well, actually, we have a high risk group here too, or I should say a high LDL, low risk, not high risk, identical, 0.7. But then came along my now new favorite study, and this was actually done in 2001. In 2001, what they did was they isolated out amongst a group of men 53 to 74, well, almost 3,000 of them, and they stratified between those who had an LDL of 4.4 and those who had it from above 4.4. Now, discretely separating out both these groups, you then further stratify inside, and what do you find? You find those people who have a high HDL and a low triglyceride on the low end being nearly identical to those on the high end. Both groups discretely divided at the high level, and we're talking, by the way, very close to the levels that you would associate with familial hypercholesterolemia. But even more exciting, if you really think about this, you'll understand why I'm more excited about this. Even more exciting, at the top end, there's virtually no difference. There's virtually no difference. If you don't change your HDL and your triglycerides, but you manage to bottom out your LDL, what does that say? How much are you actually getting to the root cause? Now, here's what's cool. What's cool is, after you bear this in mind, this same study managed to look at other risk factors, yet still stratified by the triglycerides and the HDL. You want to see how that looks? Here we have smoking versus non-smoking. Here we have physical activity levels. And one of my personal favorites, hypertension. Now, certainly hypertension on this side gets worse, particularly the higher up you are in the risk factor between the HDL and the triglycerides. But without question, HDL and triglycerides are two of the best things that you can change. And guess what? Low carb, high fat diet changes them for almost everybody I know, particularly within my family. So now you can understand why it is that I like to see this. I don't pay as much attention to LDL cholesterol. I want to emphasize one more time, I by no means am certain on the outcome of either LDL cholesterol or LDL particle count, and I really want to put that forward. But my position on this with HDL cholesterol and triglycerides is in fact evidence-based. All of the evidence as it stands right now, and even absent my attempts to try to find otherwise, is showing that this is by far the most relevant factor to the cardiovascular disease outcome. And I'm not even talking about the stuff we know is under the surface, things like fasting insulin and HOMA-IR and hypertension and all these other things that low-carb diets can also address as well that are specific to cardiovascular disease. So now let's kind of change gears a little bit. What happens if you've got a high HDL cholesterol, but your triglycerides are high? Well, actually, here's where I want to give some specific advice. But the first thing is that you need to note that triglycerides are very volatile. I've done, as I said, 105 blood tests. Of the different things that correlate with the diet, the one that doesn't and has the highest degree of standard deviation from where I would expect it to be are triglycerides. So a change of 20 to 30% since the last testing can be fairly common. Bear that in mind. You still want to be near the preferred range, but don't be surprised that much if your triglycerides change. I laugh whenever somebody comes at me with like a 5% change or something like that. It's just, there's no point. And also bear in mind, if the patient has eaten unusually in the days before the test, particularly with added carbs, and in particular, fructose and alcohol, those can have an impact, especially on triglycerides. Okay, so here are the top reasons for high triglycerides that we find. Now, one is the one I just kind of talked about. You want to confirm that the patient was water-only fasted for 12 to 14 hours before their cholesterol test. Again, no food, no coffee, just water. And the more outside that window you are in either direction, as in if you've also multi-day fasted, again, that can also increase your triglycerides, not just your LDL, but also your triglycerides. And here's the bullet point that I don't want to show you, or at least I want like a face mask or something to put on to protect myself, because this is usually where large objects are thrown my way. Are you ready? You may have a coffee sensitivity. Now, ever since we've exposed this, it sure enough has turned out that a lot of people who quit coffee for 10 days and retest can find their triglycerides will drop by a lot. It's not everybody, folks. It's just a few people. And the worst part about this is it seems like the few people that it has the most profound effect on are the ones who are the most addicted to their coffee. Data is data. That's all I'm going to say. Okay, so let's flip it. What if your HDL cholesterol is low and your triglycerides are low? Well, triglycerides are low, so that suggests that there is good and appropriate amount of turnover. But now this is a little bit trickier. Here are the top reasons we find for low HDL-C when triglycerides are low. Now, the first one that we think, and again, this is somewhat speculative, is that there's a possible genetic influence. We tend to find that usually once we get to certain people, we dig into the S&Ps, we tend to find that sure enough, there is a factor to that. And if so, you want to compare this to prior tests when they were not low carb. That tends to be a big clue. So let's say that they have a mom who's always had persistently low HDL, they had a dad who had persistently low HDL, and they themselves had a very low HDL until they went low carb, and even though their HDL improved or got better, it still was low by what we consider today's standards. It seems to suggest that it could be genetic. Also consider with the Feldman protocol, when people do, like say, have enormous amounts of fat and they see their HDL marginally go up, maybe not in too exciting of a way, but still a marginal bump, that too suggests that it could be genetically related. Now that said, I don't want you to get lazy and assume genetics. Try to rule it out. There may be a more serious underlying issue. Consider running a wider array of blood tests to confirm no further potential problems. There actually are a number of different illnesses that can impact HDL levels, and so it sometimes can be good to go ahead and get to the wider spectrum, but also in rare cases, there can be acute drop to HDL-C, again, I really want to emphasize this, in which it can be associated with cancer. And by the way, those are cases where in all the times that's happened, it's been a very, very acute drop that was very dramatic. It was like, I want to say, around 35 or 40% drop, and there wasn't any particularly good reason for it. It was just something that was quite surprising. Now, I can't tell you how many times I've had family members going, I've been doing the diet. What the heck? It's not showing up. And I have a line that I want to give you guys that I think every physician should use, and it's, don't convince me, convince your blood work. I'm just the messenger, right? That's all there is to it. So here are the top reasons for high triglycerides and low HDL-C, which by the way is of course typically associated with atherogenic dyslipidemia. The patient may have carb leaks. Have them get serious about tracking their food. Common unaccounted for leaks, I've ran into all of these several times. Sauces, spices, beverages, alcohol, and many things labeled 0 carb, 0 grams of carbs, that actually aren't, and oftentimes can be rounded down. We really have this problem in the United States, by the way. You guys are way ahead of us on this. If you can, have them use a glucometer. Glucometer is just amazing, of course. And of course, the CGM is just absolutely fantastic for being able to detect it. But bottom line, many who have even moderate carbs, while on a low-carb, high-fat diet can see their triglycerides spike because it's still too much of an energy surplus. This is actually something I'm very vocal on, particularly within my own family. There are a lot of people who they go on a low-carb diet, they get very comfortable slathering on the butter, right? And they find the love of fat and a lack of fear for the intense fat. And then what happens? They loosen up just a little bit on the carbohydrates. And I'm telling you, I've seen it over and over again. It can have dramatic effects on triglycerides. It can have dramatic effects on fasting insulin. I've seen this within my own family. And by the way, this is actually why I like triglycerides. Triglycerides of all of the different markers seems to be the best cheat detector. If triglycerides are spiking up dramatically, and particularly if they've said that they've been eating properly and all the other stuff has been ruled out, I'm usually going, I'm wondering about your carbs. I want to know if you've got maybe some leaks going on. So look, here's my top advice for high triglycerides. Cut out refined, liquid, and concentrated forms of fat. Just do it, right? Drop bulletproof coffee. I know. Oils, fat shakes, fat bombs. Move towards as much fat from real food as you possibly can. A lot of times I'm using low carb to be kind of a gateway with my own friends and family. They kind of get into it, but what helped them transition into it was that they needed those treats, right? But those of you who've been on it for a long time realize that actually your cravings for treats can start to subside. The trick is to catch how much of that is truly habitual. And the problem is if you have habits of having treats, like you meet certain friends and they're into the treats, or you have other family, they like to have treats, you want to be sure you're having treats with them, that sort of thing, that can keep the activation still going. But a lot of times, if they're still struggling, and particularly if they're at red zone, with high triglycerides, low HDL, I start saying you may just be very insulin resistant. It may not be enough for you to bring your carbs under 20. Like in the case of my dad needs to have his carbs under 15. Under 15. I'm not kidding when I tell you this. If he can have his carbs at like say 20, 22, and he'll see an increase of anywhere between 10 and 15% of his fasting glucose the next day by just that little bit, right? It makes a difference. I wanted to actually show you this real quick because these are the kinds of things that you get when you start actually getting lots of data in front of you. And what I loved is this is a lot of low carbers who've sent this in from, this is actually, I want to say 400 data points from a recent survey that we ran into. What I loved is it kind of confirmed something I saw before. Now, as a scatter plot goes, this doesn't look that great because you're not going to get a good regression curve. But if you look closely, there's something actually quite easy to spot. If you're looking just at the left side over here, you're seeing how it's kind of scattered all over the place. Look over the right side over here. It's pretty flattened down. So actually, look at that. When your HDL-C is right there at about 1.29, over to the left side, that's when everything starts to go awry. And that, by the way, is a pattern we've seen for a long time. That typically when HDL is down to a little level, that's when you start to see issues like this. A lot of people who are in this space think of things from a lipoprotein-centric model, as in those little boats are the problem. We look at things from a systemic standpoint, where basically the lipoproteins tend to reflect what the state of the system is. And that's why it's not so much you should take any kind of drug or some special anything that increases your HDL because you're thinking in terms of I need to make more HDL. You want to think in terms of what gets my system to a place in which HDL would be more prominent anyway. That's how you want to think of it. So there's going to be some people who are like, okay, that's great, Dave. I still want to go for lowering LDL on a low-carb diet. In which case, here's some advice for you. First, based on my research, and particularly the energy status research, as I was talking about before, if you're more fat adapted, you're delivering more fatty acids via these boats, there's a fairly straightforward way to deal with this, and that is you can swap carbs in and fat out. Don't add to carbs, swap them in for fat. I meant what I said. Emphasis on swap. So you all are witnesses. If anybody leaves this room thinking for 1 second I ever said to add carbs in order to reduce your cholesterol, I can tell you right now there are already people who've misinterpreted my research online and said, oh, based on your energy status experiments, I carb loaded coming up to this cholesterol test, and lo and behold, their cholesterol spiked like crazy. Don't do that. No. What the quick geeky, I'm going to get geeky for just a second, what the quick geeky theory is that basically if you can get your glycogen stores up, especially in your liver past a certain threshold, there seems to be less of a need on the part of the body, which makes perfect sense, to mobilize as many of the fatty acids in VLDLs, and therefore you have less LDLs. There you go. That's it. That's as far as I'm going to go on that one. You can also, you hear this all the time, I'm not the first to bring this to you, reduce saturated fat in favor of monounsaturated fat. Now I'll say this verbally, but I don't want to put it up on the slide. You can increase your polyunsaturated fatty acids. I myself am not a fan. I don't think bringing up PUFAs in order to bring down your LDL, given what I know up to this point in time, makes me feel comfortable. That's just my 2 cents. You can add more insoluble fiber. Insoluble fiber in particular seems to, for some people, have a more potentially profound effect and can be somewhat relevant. So now I have some powerful new CIMT data. This is actually maybe the 10 most powerful data points that I have from this year. So you guys are familiar with the carotid intima media thickness test? Basically, the gist of it is you're capturing the thickness in the, depending on if they use the common carotid artery or not, but basically you're trying to catch the intima and the media together. And here's an example of what it looks like. It's an ultrasound. And here's an example of a gal who's actually taking it. I've been tracking my carotid arteries, both the left and right, every 6 months. And I was excited to see that it was slowly regressing on my left carotid artery. Then, sure enough, I saw my right carotid artery, which actually started up a lot higher. And it too started regressing to where actually both of them ended up right next to each other in total thickness. In fact, they almost perfectly match by November 2017, which of course was almost a year ago. Fantastic. Now, the one experiment that I haven't talked to you about, but maybe I will if there's enough time, is I did a weight gain experiment. The weight gain experiment meant that quite literally I gained weight over 4 weeks. The details for that I'll save for later. But I actually left the ketogenic diet, went on a standard American diet, and tried to gain about 20 to 25 pounds. If there's ever a movie about this whole story, there will have to be a scene where I walk in one night to my wife who's in bed and I said, honey, it really helped my research a lot if I could gain a lot of body fat. What happened next was something I'll keep out of the movie, but I'll just say, ultimately she ended up supporting this. So here, by the end of this, I had gained 19 pounds. I was wondering what my next carotid intima media thickness test would show. So this is what happened on my left carotid artery following that 4-week standard American diet experiment where I gained 19 pounds. The highest it had ever been. And on the right side, also the highest. Both sides. So what I kind of like from a data perspective is that we see it happen in each place. It isn't just one data point from one area to where we could say this might have been a lab error. That's a hell of a lab error. For those of you who are in the know, yes, it was the same tech, and yes, it was the same machine. So very credible data, 4 or 5 data points. Now, here's the kicker. The kicker is, even after we go ahead and add that, for these first 4 rows, what was my LDL cholesterol average over that time? It was super crazy high. My LDL-C was double that of the recommended average. So I had above 200 milligrams per deciliter. I'm not going to be able to convert it, but you're going to have to trust me. It's double what the guidelines would say. And my LDL particle count was likewise also double. And following the 4-week standard American diet experiment, I did hypothesize before I did this, and I turned out to be right, that my LDL-C would go down to where it was before I started the ketogenic diet, which is exactly what happened. It returned to 130. And of course, a low LDL particle count. Some would say it's not low enough because some people try to get to super low levels. But the point is, it ended up being half. Now look at that. 4 rows in which you see me operating at very high levels, 90th percentile, LDL-C and LDL-P, and what's happening to my carotid arteries? They are thinning. What happens after I go standard American diet? Well, if my doctor was only looking at these 2 numbers, I'd be saying, whatever you're doing, keep doing that. All right, so this is the resistance training experiment. For those of you who are interested in whether or not you can lower LDL in another way, you might be interested in this. I don't know if you guys have heard of Peter Attia. I'm just going to go ahead and skip to the translation to save time. Translation is basically this. Hey, I think when you make your muscles sore, they eat LDL particles to grow and repair. That is otherwise known as receptor-mediated endocytosis in the peripheral tissues. I've gotten a lot of pushback from lipidologists, including Peter Attia and Dayspring and so forth, that that's actually happening that much at all. I think it is. And I think it explains a phenomenon that you tend to see in the low-carb community with people who do a lot of resistance training, a lot of weightlifting and so forth, that for some reason their LDL will tend to be lower than the people I showed you a little bit earlier that tend to be runners, bikers, yoga instructors, and so forth. And I believe that's because after those boats have delivered their triglycerides and now become LDL particles, there's a good reason for those to be in your system. And one of those reasons are that actually it turns out your cell membranes, which are made of a phospholipid bilayer, also have cholesterol. So phospholipids, cholesterol. That's your cell membranes. Outside of a lot of keroproteins, a whole bunch of other things. It's a low-density lipoprotein. What's that boat made of? It's made of phospholipids and cholesterol. Why would it be that virtually all of our cells that have a nucleus also have receptors that part of their job is that they can snag these LDL particles, like it's literally an LDL receptor. Why would they have that? And then have a process where they actually bind on several different parts, pinch it into the cell, and then pull it apart and make use of it. Well, I'm an engineer, so for me it's like kind of obvious. It's like if Home Depot's driving past your house a lot and you need some home repairs, it's free. And you say, okay, come into the garage. That's great. I can go ahead and start using it. So this was my plan. My plan was to keep everything identical from one day to the next for 20 days straight. These are not duplicates, by the way. So yes, this was basically Groundhog Day. And I'm only showing 5 of the days. This carries over for 15 more days that I don't have in here. Fortunately, I had a cardio check, and I was taking my lipid tests each day. So I happen to have 8 data points. It's great. Looks fairly flat. So what happens when I introduce the first change, the only change, which is that I go ahead and do the vibration plate and some HIIT exercises in order to induce some muscle soreness. Now this is a combination of both the morning readings and the 10 a.m. readings that I have. So then it's interesting, it not only dips down and comes back up again, but that happened to be when I had planned to do the second intervention, which was going to be a bit more intense. I was going to do weightlifting and also use the vibration plate again. And this is what happened. So you can actually see, once I put both overlaid, you can see the intervention phase 1, the intervention phase 2. First one dropped by around 11%, both the total and the LDL, and the second one dropped by around 13%. And I kept every other thing as controlled as I possibly could. The only thing I can never totally vouch for is sleep, because my sleep is not as consistent. But that said, virtually everything, including not just what I ate, but when I ate, not just what exercise I did, but when I did the exercise, was all the same, save those 2 changes. This was also one other fascinating thing that came out of it. I was taking my glucose and BHB every single morning, and sure enough, on the first intervention, my ketones spiked up and remained high coming into the second intervention, even spiked up a little bit higher after the second intervention before it started coming back down again. I found that that was actually pretty fascinating. And by the way, in the future, for anybody you know who's on this diet and is saying, hey, I'm thinking about taking a break for the holidays from the diet, say, I should tell you about this guy, Dave Feldman. Okay, so let me see how much time do I have? 4 minutes? Oh, 4 minutes, okay. Well, then, if you could, please thank my patrons. They've helped to provide a lot of this research directly out of their pocket. I actually ask usually on every single presentation if you could give them a hand. Thank you.